Hello and welcome back again. In this third part of the presentation on ideology, I want to get into some corollaries of the definitions that we have talked about in the second part. I want to talk about some functions, basically just try to broaden our discussion of ideology. So let me begin with one of the first major corollaries of the concept of ideology, and that is meta-ideology. Uh, what we might think of meta-ideology as indicating is the range of diversity of ideological approaches that is deemed as being acceptable within a determined political or social context. If you think about the contemporary political environment in a state like this one, in a contemporary liberal democratic Western state, this is a context in which a variety of ideological approaches are deemed as okay, are allowed into the competition, right? These include conservative ideas, liberal ideas, a range of social democratic ideas. Socialism is sometimes accepted and is sometimes not accepted, and so on. But some other approaches, fascism and racism, are definitely not admissible. Those are excluded. So meta-ideology defines the range of acceptable approaches. Now, there are some implications of this. One of the implications is that there may not necessarily be an important distinction between meta-ideology and ideology, or we could put it this way. We can raise the question of whether liberalism and conservative, if you want to take those as the two dominant ideological orientations in states of this type, are they two different ideologies, or are they rather two different variants, two instances of the meta-ideology of capitalism? Another question that we might want to raise is we know that some ideologies are identified as being extreme. We even tend to lump them together and talk about an approach that's not really an ideology, it's more of a positional indicator called extremism. And we can raise the question, what is extremism? And how do we distinguish sets of ideas that are extreme from sets of ideas that are not extreme? And how does this border move? When this border moves, this tells us about the scope of the meta-ideology. A further point about ideology is that, as you may have already gotten the sense in the previous part of the presentation, any ideology is going to borrow from and is going to be derived from certain philosophical ideas. And in the last part, when we were referencing Immanuel Kant, we identified particular types of ideas that are dominant. That is, ideas about human nature, ideas about the character of history, ideas about whether history is moving toward any sort of destiny or not. That is to say that ideologies in many ways look like philosophy, but they are not the same as philosophy. Ideologies do not have the consistency and do not have the internal coherence of philosophy. Instead, we can think of ideology as a way of using ideas derived from philosophy to advocate or to justify a set of concrete propositions in the social and political environment, and to try to assign to them some of the transcendence that is associated with philosophy. I mean, in that sense, we can talk about ideology as having a purpose. What is the purpose? I mean, let's start by looking at the critical approach. What Roland Barthes argues about ideology is that ideology is fundamentally myth that has the purpose of reinforcing order, right? It's an expression of power. So sometimes we use the term, the historicists use the term dominant ideology. For Barthes, the term dominant ideology is redundant. If it's not dominant, it's not ideology. And if it's not ideology, it's not dominant. What ideology does instead is to take a condition of dominance and to make it appear to be natural and inevitable. We can contrast this with the view of the historicists that sees a dominant ideology but also sees latent and emergent ideologies, probably multiple ones. One way of resolving what appears to be a dispute here is to think that they share a core element, and that is that all of them conceive of ideologies as seeking dominance. That is, they all have a similar goal, which is to identify the interest of a group that's expressed through ideology with the way of nature or with the interest of the whole collective, okay? And in that sense, ideology might also be thought of as a type of political strategy. But it's a political strategy that draws its power from the world of ideas. And this is where one of its most important weaknesses is. And the source of this important weakness is that in every ideology, there are contradictions. I mean, we can probably identify these contradictions pretty easily and quickly, although it's possible to go into a lot of detail on this and to make it a question for research. But one way of answering the question is to ask. I mean, let's assume for a moment, for the sake of argument, that we can identify a set of ideologies as being left and a set of ideologies as being right, and ask what motivates a person to be attracted to either right or left ideology. Why don't we start with right ideology? For right ideology, the attractive elements are first of all a belief in limitations on the power of government and power on the state, and at the same time, an interest in social regulation and maintenance of consensus and unity, including, for example, strong defense and police and strong social regulation. So the basic contradiction, the contradiction at the heart of right ideology, is this contradiction between a belief in limitation of state power and the advocacy of an image of the state and an ideal of the social collective that depends on very strong state power. We could do the same thing in talking about left ideologies. I mean, for left ideologies, probably the most attractive element for most people attracted to them is the idea of equality. And then you get into implementation of the idea of equality and find that it requires this heavy degree of regulation and modulation of human activity. So for left ideologies, probably the basic contradiction is the contradiction between, on the one hand, the idea of equality, and on the other hand, the valuation of freedom. Any time that the contradictions at the heart of an ideological approach become apparent, this is also a moment when the weakness of ideology becomes apparent. And because of this, advocates of ideological points of views will try to avoid entering into this realm of contradiction. And this is why you tend to see an ideological discourse, and especially in public political discourse, you're able to see this in times of elections, wars, other types of campaigns, movement toward the least common denominator, movement toward statements that are effectively meaningless because they are so broad. And this is why you get politicians and political movements making promises like people will have jobs, or we will support the troops, or we offer you a better life, because the further an ideology can move away from its ideas, the safer the ideology is. In the next section of this presentation, we'll talk about some possible applications of the concept of ideology and hopefully offer some ways that ideology can be a useful idea in doing your analysis in political sociology.